In 1803, along the humid coast of Georgia, the first thing they stole from her was not her labor. It was her name. When she stepped off the wagon onto red soil she did not know, a man holding a ledger dipped his pen in ink and asked no questions. He did not ask about the language she spoke, the river she had grown beside, or the mother who once braided her hair beneath a West African sun. He wrote a new name beside a number and closed the book. "Grace," he said. The word sounded soft, almost gentle, but it landed like a blow. Her name was Adesuwa. She did not say it aloud. Not yet. The wagon had come from Savannah, where the slave markets operated in full public view. Adesuwa had been on American soil for fewer than 3 weeks. The crossing, the Middle Passage, had taken 41 days. Of the 219 people who boarded the ship in the Bight of Benin, 187 arrived in the United States. 32 did not survive the ocean. She had survived by remaining very still inside herself. She had created an interior space where the noise, the suffering, the unbearable smells and sounds of that hold could not entirely reach her. In that interior space, she repeated her name, over and over, like a prayer or like an anchor. Adesuwa, Adesuwa, Adesuwa. The men with ledgers did not know they were taking it. They believed they were assigning a name. They did not understand that a name given by another person, without consent, without connection, without the breath of ancestors behind it, was not a name at all. It was a label, a mark, a tool of administration. But a name given by a mother, spoken in the language of the village, carried inside the chest for 22 years, that was something entirely different. That was identity. That was inheritance. That was the thread connecting a person to every generation that came before them. They could write Grace in the ledger, but they could not write away what she already was. The plantation sat near the tidal marshes of coastal Georgia, where rice grew in heavy, shimmering fields that stretched to the treeline under a sky that never seemed to stop pressing down. The air was thick with insects, salt water, and the scent of wet earth. The heat was a physical presence, something you moved through, not merely felt. Work began before the sun cleared the horizon, and continued long after the sky had swallowed the last red stain of evening. The enslaved quarters were a row of rough wooden cabins positioned at the far edge of the plantation, near enough to be controlled, far enough to be forgotten. The structures had dirt floors, walls of hewn timber that let in both wind and insects, and windows no larger than a man's arm span. Inside them, languages collided in the evenings, Igbo, Yoruba, Mende, Twi, and the broken shapes of English that emerged when people with no shared tongue attempted to communicate with one another. Many of the adults on that plantation were first-generation Africans. They had been brought across the Atlantic in the final years before the official close of the American international slave trade. The act prohibiting importation of slaves would not take effect until 1808, and in those years before the deadline, the trade intensified. Slave ships multiplied. The numbers of captured Africans shipped to American ports increased sharply in the years between 1800 and 1808 as traders rushed to supply demand before the Prohibition. Because so many of the enslaved on this plantation had come directly from Africa, the quarter had a different texture from those on inland plantations where American-born enslaved populations predominated. Here, African dialects were spoken in corners and whispered at night. Here, traditional practices survived in fragments. A way of greeting, a method of preparing food, a rhythm tapped on the side of a wooden bucket that recalled a drum pattern from thousands of miles away. Adesuwa observed all of this. She catalogued it. She understood, without being told in words she fully recognized yet, that memory was a form of survival. That to remember was to resist. That the plantation's power depended not only on controlling bodies, but on emptying minds. They could not empty hers. At night, when the overseer's boots no longer crunched against gravel, when the big house had gone dark, and when the only sounds were insects and the distant movement of marsh water, she would lie on her narrow wooden pallet and whisper her name into the darkness. Adesuwa. The word felt like breathing after drowning. She traced the shape of its first syllable into the dirt floor with her finger, pressing carefully, so the outline would remain until morning, when she would look at it once more, and then smooth it away before the day's work began. She carved its first letter beneath the edge of the wooden bed frame where no inspector, no overseer, no plantation visitor would think to look. She repeated it silently as she worked in the rice fields, matching its syllables to the rhythm of her steps along the dikes, to the pull and push of her labor, to the bend of her back and the straightening. She said it in her mind as she moved between the stalks. She said it when she was called Grace, and turned to answer. She said it like a counterspell, because a name, she understood, had always understood, in the marrow of her, was not merely a sound. It was memory, and memory was resistance. She also observed, quietly and with increasing clarity, what happened to those who did not resist in this way. She watched a man named Kofi, whom they called Tom, stop correcting those who used the English name. She watched it happen over months. The shortening of his posture when the name was used, the gradual cessation of the reflex that had once made his jaw tighten. She watched him stop whispering in his own language. She watched him dream, apparently, in a language she no longer heard him use while awake. She did not judge him. She understood. The pressure was immense and relentless. To hold on to a name no one around you used, that no one was permitted to use, that placed you in danger if discovered. This required a continuous expenditure of interior energy that the plantation system seemed designed to exhaust. They worked you until your body was empty, and then they expected your mind to follow. Adesuwa refused. Even when the overseer shouted grace across the fields and she turned to answer, she allowed herself half a breath of delay. Not enough to invite a punishment. Not enough to be visible. But enough, just enough, to remind herself that the name was a garment they had thrown over her. It was not her skin. She was not Grace. She was Adesuwa. In 1805, in the month that the plantation records would later list as August, she gave birth to a daughter inside the slave quarters. The labor was long and difficult. A woman named Nana, older, who had been on this plantation for 7 years, and who spoke a West African dialect close enough to Adesuwa's that they could communicate in the gaps between languages, served as midwife. Nana caught the child with hands that had caught many children in this place and on the continent before it. She wiped the baby clean with a cloth and looked at the child with an expression that Adesuwa read as something between grief and defiance. The expression of a woman who understood precisely what this child had been born into and who chose, in spite of that knowledge, to receive her with ceremony. She placed the baby in Adesuwa's arms. The plantation owner recorded the child in his ledger the next morning. He wrote a single line, August 1805, female child born to Grace. Named Eliza. He assigned a monetary value beside the name. The child was property before she was named. She had value before she had a self. Adesuwa waited until night. She held her daughter close to her body, felt the warmth of the small chest rising and falling, felt the grip of tiny fingers against her own, and she whispered another name into the child's ear. An ear still new to the world, still learning the difference between sounds worth remembering and sounds worth forgetting. Folake. It was a Yoruba name. It meant, one who is cherished, one who is placed in the care of wealth, one given into the keeping of love. She whispered it again. She made her understand, as soon as the baby was old enough to form sounds, what the name meant and why it mattered. Over and over, in the minutes between exhaustion and sleep, in the brief moments when the day loosened its grip, Adesuwa pressed the name into her daughter's forming mind. Your name is Folake. Not the one they call you. The one I give you. The act was dangerous. If overheard, if reported by another enslaved person seeking favor from the overseer, if discovered during one of the random inspections that the plantation system conducted to search for evidence of communication, organization, or anything that suggested that the enslaved were anything other than compliant, it could be punished. But to allow her daughter to grow without that inheritance felt like a second death. And Adesuwa had already survived one crossing. She knew the difference between the things that could kill you and the things that were worse than being killed. Losing your name to silence was worse. The plantation functioned on order. Order required control. And control, the plantation system had discovered over 200 years of refinement across the American colonies and later the Republic, required erasure. You could not own a fully realized human being without that human being's awareness of their own worth threatening the arrangement. You could not extract unlimited labor from people who remembered that their labor had once been their own. You could not breed human beings like livestock, separating families, assigning reproductive partners, calculating genetic value, if those human beings maintained a framework of kinship and belonging that made such treatment feel as monstrous as it was. So the plantation system sought to destroy that framework. It began with the name. Enslaved Africans were renamed for convenience, for ownership, for the assertion of dominance, and sometimes for what appeared to be cruelty dressed in humor, names that were deliberately diminishing, or that transformed a person into an object of comedy for the white household. Biblical names were common, as were the names of classical antiquity: Hercules, Caesar, Cato. Names from the enslaver's own family were assigned as a form of marking, branding by syllable instead of iron. Rarely did any of the assigned names reflect the humanity, the history, or the personal meaning of the person forced to carry them. Adesuwa observed the consequences with the careful attention of someone studying a threat. She observed how language itself began to erode in those who stopped using their mother tongue, not because they chose to forget, but because there was no one to speak it with. Language requires exchange. A word spoken to no one eventually stops being spoken, and a word unspoken for long enough eventually stops being heard, even in the mind. She observed how the younger children, born on this plantation, in many cases knew no African language at all. They had grown up inside English. English was the language of their fear, their commands, their lullabies, their prayers. They had no other container for their interior life. And because the English they were permitted to use was the English of the enslaved, limited, monitored, controlled, even their interior life was shaped by the constraints of their condition. She observed how the older Africans, one by one, under the pressure of isolation and exhaustion, stopped teaching their languages to the young, not because they wanted to forget, but because remembering hurt. Adesuwa understood that pain. She felt it daily. The gap between who she was inside herself and what she was permitted to be outside herself was a constant wound. Not dramatic, not visible, but deep and chronic, the kind of wound that doesn't kill quickly but changes the shape of everything it touches. She chose to keep the wound open, because the wound meant she had not forgotten, and not forgetting meant she was still there. And still being there, still being Adesuwa beneath the name Grace, was the only form of freedom available to her. She would use it. One afternoon in the autumn following Folake's birth, new captives arrived at the plantation. Adesuwa felt it before she saw them. A shift in the quality of silence in the quarter, the particular tension that spread through a group of people when something both hoped for and feared approaches. She had come to read these atmospheric changes the way she had once read weather on the river at home, through small signs, changes in light, the way sound moved. She saw them that evening. 6 people, 3 men and 3 women, recently off a ship from the sound of their English, which was to say they had almost none, and from the look of them, still wearing the disorientation of the crossing as a physical condition. They moved carefully, as if the ground could not be trusted. As if the world itself might shift without warning, she recognized it. She had moved that way herself. That evening, she heard it, in the corner of the women's cabin, a sound she had not heard since the ship. A dialect close enough to her own that it resonated inside her chest the way a bell resonates, not just heard, but felt. A woman was weeping, and the weeping had a particular cadence, shaped by a language that held words Adesuwa had not heard spoken aloud in 2 years. She approached carefully. She could not afford to be noticed doing so. She sat near the young woman, younger than her, perhaps 19, with the particular stillness of someone who has been terrified long enough that the terror has become the baseline, and she waited until they were alone. And then, in a voice below a whisper, she spoke. She did not speak in English. The young woman's head lifted from her knees as if pulled by a rope. Adesuwa spoke her name. Her true name. Adesuwa. The young woman stared at her. And then she said it back, haltingly, as if testing whether the sound was real. Adesuwa? It was the first time anyone on that plantation had said it back to her. In that moment, something that had been held in careful suspension inside Adesuwa's chest shifted. Something reassembled itself that she had not, until this moment, fully recognized as being in pieces. She was seen. She was heard. She existed, in her full name, to another person. The young woman's name was Efua, a Fanny name. They could not speak each other's language fully. Their dialects were related but distinct, but they shared enough vocabulary, enough structure, enough of the shape of language from the same general region of West Africa to communicate in the spaces between words. To understand not only meaning but weight, Efua would become the person Adesuwa trusted most on that plantation. And between them, in the decade that followed, they would maintain a private language, fragments of 2 dialects stitched together by shared necessity, that neither the overseer nor the plantation owner would ever fully understand. As years passed and Folake grew from infant to child, the question of what to teach her and how much became the central tension of Adesuwa's life. The plantation's reach was total. It extended through the work hours and into the nights, through the physical space of the quarter and into the minds of those who lived there, through the language of the overseer and the laws of the state and the violence that enforced both. The plantation did not merely occupy the landscape. It occupied consciousness. A child growing up inside this system could easily become, in time, a person shaped entirely by it, a person whose sense of self, of possibility, of identity, was constructed entirely from the materials the plantation provided. And the plantation provided very few materials that did not ultimately serve its own perpetuation. Adesuwa refused to let her daughter have only those materials. By the time Folake was old enough to walk, she was already working in the big house, first alongside her mother, then independently, carrying water, cleaning floors, running small errands for the white household. The work had placed her inside a world of white porcelain plates and polished silver and voices that gave orders in tones that expected instant compliance. She moved silently through rooms. She had learned very early to be invisible. But at night, Adesuwa taught her what the plantation could not. She taught her fragments of language. Not full sentences. There was not enough private time for full sentences, and full sentences in a non-English language, if overheard, would be immediately identifiable as a threat. But words. Names of things. Names of places. Names of people. She taught her the name of the river near the village. She taught her the name of the grandmother who had woven cloth dyed with indigo. She taught her the word for sky and the word for water and the word for mother, the word in the language that had named her, not the language that had swallowed her. She told her about drums. She did not have drums. Drums were prohibited on many southern plantations, the prohibition stemming from slaveholder awareness that drums could transmit signals across distances, that drums were a form of communication they could not control. She described the sound of drums instead. She recreated the rhythms with her hands against her thighs, soft enough not to be heard beyond the cabin wall, with enough precision to carry the memory of a sound across an ocean. And she repeated always the essential instruction: remember, even if they sell you, even if they separate us, your name belongs to you. Folake belongs to you. They cannot write it away. They cannot sell it. They cannot put it in a ledger. The greatest fear was not death. She had come close enough to death, on the ship, in the first year on the plantation, in the years of work that stripped body and spirit, to understand that death was simply an ending. The ending of the possibility of more pain, more loss, more separation. The greatest fear was separation. And separation happened often. In the winter of 1810, debt settled over the plantation like a second winter, colder, darker, more implacable than the first. The plantation owner's finances, never robust, had been strained by several consecutive poor harvests, by the falling price of rice in international markets, and by expenses that his ledger could not absorb. He had borrowed. The creditors were no longer patient. Rumors moved through the quarter with the speed and reliability of weather reports. The enslaved had developed, of necessity, highly effective informal intelligence networks. A conversation overheard in the big house. A phrase caught between white men talking in the yard, the look on an overseer's face when he returned from town. The intelligence that December was, people would be sold. Adesuwa felt the dread settle into her body the way cold settles into old wounds, deep, specific, impossible to warm away. She had watched the threat of sale operate on the quarter for 7 years now. She had watched what the anticipation alone did to people. The sleeplessness, the hypervigilance, the terrible quality of attention that comes when you know that any ordinary day might be the last day you see the people you love. She had watched mothers lose children before. She had watched it happen in the particular, devastating way that plantation sales operated, not in the dramatic, narratable form that later abolitionists would describe in their literature, though those accounts were accurate, but in the ordinary, bureaucratic, transaction-like form that made it somehow worse. A name called. A person walked to a wagon driven away. The remaining family left behind in the field or the kitchen or the quarter, because stopping work to grieve was not permitted. She had seen men chained and marched away in the coffle, the line of enslaved people bound together for transport to markets farther south, where prices were higher and the work was harder. She had seen them marched past the fields where other enslaved people worked and watched, and she had seen both groups maintain their work, their eyes forward, because looking too long at the coffle was itself a form of expression that could be punished, and now she felt the threat moving toward her daughter. That night, she made Folake repeat her true name 3 times. Folake, the girl whispered, her voice careful in the dark. Again. Folake. And if they call you something else? If they give you another name at another place? The girl hesitated. She was 5 years old, old enough to understand that there were things in this world with the power to reorganize everything, to change the location and relationships and circumstances of a life overnight. She had heard the rumors too. "My name is Folake," she said again, stronger this time, as though the saying of it were a form of fortification. Adesuwa nodded. She pressed her daughter's hand. If her daughter survived, the name would survive. If the name survived, some thread of lineage would survive, fragile, threatened, but intact. That was all she had to give her. That was everything. The day came without ceremony. That was perhaps the most telling thing about it. The machinery of human sale in the early American Republic was efficient, practiced, stripped of hesitation. It had the quality of administrative routine. Buyers arrived on horseback, some alone, some in pairs. They moved through the quarter with the overseer. They inspected. They consulted their lists. They made offers. The plantation owner, who did not come out of the house himself for this part of the transaction, had authorized the overseer to negotiate. Ledgers were reopened. Names were called. Adesuwa was working when she heard her daughter's ledger name called. Eliza. Folake's shoulders stiffened, a movement so small that a person not watching closely would not see it. Adesuwa saw it. She crossed the distance between them in the way that an enslaved mother crosses a distance toward her child about to be sold. Not running, never running, because running was itself an act that would draw attention and punishment and make the separation worse. But with the contained urgency of someone moving under the constraint of an entire world pressing against them. She gripped her daughter's hand. Once. Hard enough to leave an imprint of warmth. There was no screaming. She had seen what screaming changed. She had seen the screaming mother dragged back and her child taken anyway, and the mother's distress used as evidence of the need for more control. No screaming. No begging. There was nothing here that could be changed by volume. Instead, she leaned forward quickly, a half-second, no more, and put her mouth close to her daughter's ear. And she whispered, in the language she had spent 5 years pressing into that ear, the words that had to travel with her daughter wherever this sale was taking her. "You are Folake. Do not forget." The girl was led away. The wagon moved. The ordinary sounds of the plantation resumed. The creak of harness, the movement of water in the marshes, the sound of work. Adesuwa returned to work. She had no other choice. She did not cry until night. And when she cried in a language that no one on that plantation could fully understand, which was, she thought, as it should be. Some grief does not belong to translation. Some grief belongs entirely to the language of its origin. And the origin of this grief was older than this country, older than the ship, older than the theft of names. The origin of this grief was love. And love, they had not managed to rename. Years passed. The rice fields continued their relentless rhythm, planting season and harvest season, flooding and draining, the constant maintenance of the irrigation systems that kept the plantation profitable. Seasons changed. New children were born into the quarter. Some were sold. Some remained. New captives arrived, their faces still wearing the particular expression of the recently arrived, a combination of exhaustion, disorientation, and a watchfulness so acute it had become its own kind of blindness, seeing everything and understanding nothing yet. Adesuwa aged in the particular way that plantation labor aged people, faster than years should account for, and in specific parts of the body. Her back had developed the slightly forward curvature of someone who had spent decades bent over crop rows. Her hands had grown rough and thickened, the hands of someone whose labor was continuous and ungentle. There were marks on her, marks that no one on the plantation had the standing to mention, and that she carried the way people carry the evidence of survival. Not as shame, but as text. But her memory sharpened. This was the thing that surprised her sometimes, that while the body bent, the interior world grew clearer. The names of the village, the sound of the river, the particular quality of light in West Africa that is different from the light of coastal Georgia in ways she could not fully articulate, but could never forget. The face of her mother, the face of her daughter. Folake would be 15 now. Adesuwa calculated it in her mind often, the way people calculate the ages of the children they cannot watch grow. 15. In a house somewhere else. Working. Moving through white rooms with the invisibility that had been trained into her from the time she was old enough to carry water. Carrying, Adesuwa hoped, a name beneath the one in the ledger. She became known among the enslaved on the plantation as someone who remembered. Not in the explicit way, no one spoke explicitly directly about resistance in a form that could be overheard and reported. but in the subtle economy of information that operated beneath the surface of the plantation's visible life, she was understood to be a repository. A woman who could tell you something true about where you came from. A woman who could give back, in fragments, something of what this place had tried to take. Younger women came to her in the evenings, not always asking in words, but sitting near her in a way that communicated the question. She spoke of Africa often, not in the romanticized way of someone trying to construct a paradise from loss. She was too precise for that, and too honest. She spoke of a river that flooded in one season and receded in another. She spoke of a grandmother who wove cloth in colors that still existed somewhere in the world, even if she could no longer see them. She spoke of a mother whose voice she could still hear, in a particular register, when she was very tired. She spoke of names. Learn them, she would say. Keep them. Teach them to your children. Even if the only place you can say them is inside your own mind, say them. Say them every day. Say them especially when they call you something else. These women listened with the total attention of people receiving something they had not known they were hungry for. In the spring of 1823, illness moved through the quarter with the impersonal efficiency of a natural disaster, which, in the context of the plantation, it was fever. The kind that came from the marshes, that settled in the chest and behind the eyes, that burned through bodies already compromised by years of insufficient nutrition, inadequate shelter, and labor that had used them past their designed capacity. It moved fastest through those who were already weakest. The very old. The very young. Those whose bodies had been giving everything for the longest time. Adesuwa felt it coming the way she had felt other thresholds, as a shift in the quality of interior experience, a change in the feel of things from the inside. She had lived in her body for 40 years, 20 of them in this country, and she knew its signals. She was not afraid. She had thought about this possibility so many times, across so many years, that its arrival felt more like the answer to a long question than like a surprise. The question had been, how long? And now the answer was moving toward her, and she found that she was, if not at peace, then at least in possession of herself. She had not let them take that. In the days before her death, she spoke to those around her. Not many words. The illness made words expensive. But the words she spent carefully. On her final night, she called Adesuwa, the young woman who had arrived frightened and weeping more than 15 years before, who had heard her own dialect spoken back to her in the dark of the cabin, who had spent those 15 years as the keeper of a private language that belonged to two people. Adesuwa sat beside her. She held her hand. Adesuwa had one thing to ask. She leaned close. Her voice was reduced now, a thing of breath more than sound, and she spoke clearly with the precision of someone who has been conserving this particular statement for a long time. My name is Adesuwa. Adesuwa nodded. Tears moved down her face without drama, the tears of someone who had been expecting this moment and had not been able to prepare for it anyway. I will say it, she promised. I will say it after you are gone. I will say it to the ones who come after. Adesuwa closed her eyes. For 20 years on Georgia soil, they had called her Grace. But she left the world as Adesuwa. She left the world knowing her name. She left the world knowing that at least one other person knew it too, and that one other person had promised to carry it forward. In the context of everything this system had tried to take from her, that was not a small victory. It was, in fact, the only victory available. And she had claimed it completely. There is no record of Adesuwa in any official archive beyond the ledger entry that recorded her arrival and the eventual entry that noted her death, the second written in the same detached handwriting as the first, and with the same absence of information about who she had been. The ledger records, March 1823. Grace. Deceased. Field hand. Lost to estate. A number followed. Her assessed value at death lower than it had been at her peak working years, as was standard practice. She was listed as a loss not because she was mourned but because she was property and property has value, and when property ceases to function, the cessation is recorded in financial terms. That is all the official record holds. But the official record is not the only record. There is another record, carried in no archive, validated by no official hand. It is the record that Adesuwa kept in her memory, and spoke aloud when it was safe to speak. The record that said, there was a woman here who came from across the water with a name that this country tried to take from her, and she did not let them take it, and she spent 20 years giving what she could not keep to the ones who would outlive her. Somewhere, perhaps on another plantation, perhaps carried south or north by the unpredictable movements of the domestic slave trade, perhaps kept in the private mind of a girl who had grown into a woman, who worked in other white rooms and answered to another name they had given her. Folake lived. And if Folake lived, she knew her name. And if she knew her name, she may have spoken it to her children. And a child who asked, "Where did this name come from? What does it mean?" may have been told, "Your name comes from Africa. Your grandmother gave it to your grandmother's grandmother. It means cherished. It means placed in the care of love." Slavery was an attempt at total erasure. It attempted to erase language, lineage, kinship, identity, history, and the human capacity for self-definition. It attempted to remake human beings as something other than human, as property, as units of labor, as bodies without interiority. In most visible ways, it succeeded in causing unimaginable harm. The numbers are staggering even to contemplate. Millions of Africans captured, millions dying in transit, millions enslaved for generations, the wealth of an entire nation built on their uncompensated labor and their unacknowledged humanity. But in one quiet, particular way, the erasure was never complete. As long as even one person remembered a name not written in the ledger, remembered it, spoke it, passed it on, the erasure was incomplete. As long as a mother pressed a true name into a child's ear in the dark of a cabin, the plantation's accounting of persons as property had failed to account for something essential. Adesuwa's rebellion was not loud. It did not set fire to buildings or break chains in public view. It left no written record. It produced no document that a later historian could hold up as evidence of conscious political resistance in the terms that histories of resistance are usually written. It survived in syllables, in whispers passed between people who trusted each other enough to speak in the dark, in the refusal of a woman for 20 years to entirely become the name they had given her, in the transmission of a name across what must have been impossible distances, of miles, of years, of sail and separation, and the relentless pressure of a system designed to prevent exactly this transmission. In the possibility, not certainty, not record, but possibility, that somewhere in the generations that followed, a child was told, "Your name comes from Africa. Your grandmother gave it to your grandmother's grandmother. It means cherished. It means placed in the care of love." That possibility is not nothing. In the history of a system that tried to make everything into nothing, that tried to convert human beings into ledger entries, into dollar amounts, into units of labor without interior life, that possibility is, in fact, everything. This is of the conviction that the history of American slavery cannot be adequately understood through statistics alone. Numbers tell us scale. They do not tell us what it was to be a person inside that scale, to resist from within conditions designed to prevent resistance, to love from within conditions designed to prevent attachment, to remember from within conditions designed to enforce forgetting. Adesuwa is one person in a story that belongs to millions. She is not representative of all enslaved experience. No single person can be. But her specific strategy of resistance, the refusal to surrender her name, the transmission of that name to her daughter, the quiet maintenance of identity beneath the surface of forced compliance, is documented as a real and recurring practice in the historical record. It was real. It happened. It continues to matter. The theft of African names was a crime not only against the individuals it was perpetrated on, but against the human record itself. Every name erased from a ledger and replaced with the enslaver's choice represents a severing of a lineage, a destruction of a linguistic and cultural inheritance, a small act of cultural genocide multiplied across hundreds of thousands of instances. The resistance to that theft, the whispered repetition, the secret teaching, the name pressed into a child's ear in the dark, was an act of preservation that operated against conditions designed to make it impossible. That it survived at all, in any form, across generations, is a testament to the force of human memory and the stubbornness of human identity in the face of systems designed to reduce persons to property. She left the world as Adesuwa. That matters. It should be said aloud. Adesuwa. The morning after Adesuwa died, Efu awoke before the others. She lay on her pallet in the pre-dawn dark of the women's cabin, and she said the name. Not in a whisper this time. In a voice that was still below the threshold that could travel through the cabin wall, but full-throated within its own limits. A voice that held the name with the deliberateness of someone taking possession of something that has been entrusted to them. Adesuwa. It was the first act of her grief and the first act of her guardianship, and she understood, as she said it, that these two things were the same. To grieve what was lost was to take responsibility for what remained. To mourn the woman was to inherit the woman's work. she had made a promise. She intended to keep it. Adesuwa had lived on this plantation for 17 years by now. She had arrived young and frightened, and the plantation had done its work on her body. Her hands bore the marks of the rice fields. Her posture carried the compression of years of deference. Her English had become fluent in the particular way of those who learn a language under conditions of forced adoption, competent and careful, with something always slightly withheld. But she had kept her own language in the private space Adesuwa had helped her identify. She had kept her name, Adesuwa, which meant, born on Friday, which was the day her mother had told her she arrived in the world. She had kept a handful of songs whose words she could no longer fully remember, but whose melodies she retained with perfect precision, because melody does not require the same cognitive retention as word. It lives in a different part of the mind, in the body, in the chest, and it is harder to erase. Now she had also been given custody of another name. Adesuwa. She would say it every morning before work. She said it at night before sleep. She said it at the funerals that were held in the quarter for those who died, the informal ceremonies that the enslaved conducted in the early hours before sunrise, because formal mourning was not permitted to interfere with the plantation's work schedule, and because the ceremonies that felt truest were not the ones supervised by white ministers who preached compliance, born and who, despite everything, still knew the names of their own languages. They did not speak at length. They were old, careful, conservative in how they deployed the knowledge they held. But at the Hush Harbor meetings, in the clearing at the plantation's edge that the enslaved had been using for 11 years without being discovered, they sometimes spoke the names of those who had died in the languages those people would have been born into. The first time Folake heard this, she was in her early 20s. She sat in the darkness of that clearing, surrounded by the careful, quiet press of other bodies, and listened to an old man speak a name in a language that was not English, not the language her mother had whispered to her, but something else, something whose structure she did not know but whose quality she recognized. The quality of a name in its original language. The sound of a word that belongs entirely to the person it describes. She wept in silence, and she did not know entirely why. She knew why. It was because this was what her mother had been protecting. Not just the specific words, not just the name Folake or the name Adesuwa, but this, the principle of having a name that was real. The principle of being spoken of in a language that had been made to describe you, not to manage you. In 1828, Folake, Eliza in the ledger, 23 years old, assigned to the plantation house and known to the white household as quiet, reliable, invisible, was formally partnered with a man named Samuel. The word married is complicated in the context of enslaved people in antebellum Georgia. Enslaved people were not legally permitted to marry. The law that governed their existence treated them as property, and property cannot enter into legal contracts, and marriage is a legal contract. Enslavers sometimes facilitated informal partnership ceremonies for their enslaved workers, recognizing that stable partnerships reduced certain management problems. But these ceremonies had no legal standing. They could be dissolved at any time by sale, by the decision of the enslaver, by debt, by death. Samuel was a man she had come to know over 3 years of careful attention. He was from the Upper South, born in Virginia to a family that had been enslaved there for 3 generations, which meant he had no direct memory of Africa and no African language, which was one of the things she was learning to account for in her understanding of herself and her inheritance. Not everyone she would know would carry the same thread she carried. Not everyone had a mother who had pressed a true name into their ear. He was gentle in the way that some men in impossible circumstances managed to be gentle. Not despite those circumstances, but in precise, deliberate opposition to them, as though gentleness were itself a form of resistance against the brutality that the system normalized. She trusted him with her name. She did not tell him immediately. She waited until she was certain. And then, in the privacy of the evening, she told him. Not just the name, but the story. The woman in Georgia who had arrived from Africa and refused to forget. The whisper in her ear at the moment of separation. The years of private practice that had kept the name alive in her mind through 10 years of a childhood in which no one called her by it. Samuel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I don't have a name like that. They named me Samuel in Virginia. I don't know what my grandfather's name was before Virginia." She nodded. She had expected something like this. "Then Samuel is your name," she said. "And you know where it didn't come from, which is already something. And if we have children, I will give them what my mother gave me. And maybe that is enough." Samuel considered this for a while. Then he said, "Tell me her name again." Adesuwa, she said. What does it mean? The crown has returned. He repeated it carefully, syllable by syllable. Adesuwa. She looked at him. You will remember that? I will remember that, he said. Two people now held the name on this plantation, and neither of them had known the woman who had carried it for 20 years through the Georgia rice fields. The name had traveled beyond the knowledge of the woman herself. It had become, in the way that all lasting things become, larger than its origin. Between 1830 and 1840, Folake gave birth to 4 children. The plantation recorded them with the same detachment it recorded livestock. Date, sex, assessed initial value, name assigned. The names in the ledger were James, Martha, Henry, and Charlotte. The names in the cabin were different. For each child, Folake maintained the practice her mother had established. A name given in the language that had come from before this country, whispered in the first hours of life, repeated until the child could say it back. A name that existed beneath the name in the ledger. A name that was theirs entirely, that could not be bought or sold or recorded in someone else's book. She gave the oldest, James, in the ledger, the name Kalad. It was a Yoruba name, one she had been holding in her memory since the night Bess had told her that Folake was a Yoruba name and that Yoruba was what her lineage spoke. She had been collecting Yoruba words wherever she could find them since that night. She had found another woman on the plantation who knew fragments, an old man who had been Yoruba speaking as a child and who still, in his extreme age, would sometimes lapse into it. From these fragments she had assembled a small vocabulary. Not enough for conversation, but enough for naming. For the second child, Martha in the ledger, she gave the name Adesuwa. She had been holding this in reserve. She had known, from the moment she understood the full weight of what her mother had given her, that she would give this name to a daughter. That the name would continue in the direct female line, if she had a female child to give it to. The night the second child was born, she held her in the darkness of the cabin, and she whispered the name into her ear as her mother had whispered it into hers. Adesuwa. Then she told her what it meant. The crown has returned. Then she told her where it came from. From your grandmother. From Africa. From a woman who came across the water and would not let them take her name. The child was too young to understand the words. But the words were planted. They would grow as the child grew. They would be there when the child was old enough to ask questions about where she had come from and who she was. And if they were separated, which could happen, had happened to Folake herself, could happen to this child, could happen at any moment, because the separation of families was a feature of this system and not an aberration, the name would travel with the child. The crown would keep returning. The 1840s and 1850s in Georgia were decades in which the institution of slavery became, paradoxically, both more entrenched and more unstable. More entrenched because the economic stakes grew higher as cotton prices rose and the plantation economy expanded westward. More unstable because the political contradictions of a democracy built on human bondage were becoming impossible to sustain without increasingly visible violence. In the Congress, in the territories, in the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, in the rhetoric of Southern politicians who spoke with growing desperation of the necessity of protecting an institution they increasingly understood to be under threat. The enslaved people of Georgia's plantations experienced these decades as their own kind of intensification. The Fugitive Slave Act brought new visibility to the question of freedom and its geography. The Underground Railroad, though its operations in Georgia were more limited than in the Upper South, represented a possibility. Not available to most, not safe for many who attempted it, but present in the collective imagination in ways that shaped how people held their present condition. The Hush Harbor meetings became more politically charged. The preaching in the invisible church, always dual-coded, moved closer to the surface of its meaning. Songs that had always contained the hope for liberation began to feel less metaphorical and more calendrical, as though the thing they described was not an abstraction but a predicted event, and the question was not whether it would come, but when. Folake was in her 40s now. Her body bore the specific record of those decades, the housework and the field work that had been required of her in seasons when the housework was insufficient, the births and the losses, the chronic fear and the chronic suppression of fear. She moved with the particular deliberateness of someone who has learned to conserve energy, to spend nothing unless the expenditure is worth it. But she was, in her way, ready. She had spent 40 years preparing herself and her children for something. She had not known exactly what form the something would take. She had known it would require that they know who they were, that they not be empty of themselves when the moment came, that there be a self to receive whatever was coming. Her daughter Adesuwa, Charlotte in the ledger, now 18 years old, worked in the fields and carried in her the name she had been given on the first night of her life, and the story that went with it, and the practice that her mother and grandmother before her had maintained. The daily recitation of the interior archive, the names and meanings and fragments of language and geographical memory that constituted a lineage the plantation had failed to entirely destroy. Folake watched her daughter work in the cotton fields, and felt the particular pride of a person who has transmitted something against all odds. Not an uncomplicated pride. The circumstances did not permit uncomplicated feeling. But a pride that was also a form of love and also a form of defiance. The crown has returned, that it kept returning. In April of 1861, the war that the political crisis had been making inevitable for a decade finally began. The news traveled through the same channels that all news traveled, through the networks the enslaved had been maintaining for generations, through the overheard conversations of white men who did not fully credit the intelligence of those who served them, through the language of implication and inference that the enslaved had developed across centuries of living in proximity to power that discussed their fate openly and expected them to be deaf. They were not deaf. The plantation felt the war's approach as a change in atmosphere before it felt it in any tangible way. The white household became quieter and more tense. The overseer's presence became less predictable. The conversations that white men had on the porch became shorter and ended when enslaved people appeared with water or food or the other small services that white households required continuously. Folake, now in her mid-50s, had survived the plantation for 50 years. She had survived the domestic trade, the separation from her mother, the death of the woman who had given her her name, the birth and partial dispersal of her own children through the economy of human sale, the decades of labor that had made this country's cotton economy profitable and her body less so. She was still here. She was still Folake. Her daughter Adesuwa, now in her late 20s, had her mother's quality of interior steadiness, the quality that comes from having been given something worth protecting, and having protected it long enough that protection becomes character. In the Hush Harbor clearing at the plantation's edge, during those years of war, the meetings became more urgent. People prayed with the particular intensity of those who believe the thing they are praying for is close. They sang the songs. They spoke the names. Folake, at these meetings, sometimes spoke of her mother. The story had been told so many times now, across so many years, that it had taken on the quality of something between personal memory and shared mythology. The woman who came from Africa and kept her name. The woman who gave the name to a daughter at the moment of separation. The name that had traveled across decades and plantations and generations, arriving here, in this clearing, in the mouths of people who had never been to Georgia and had never met a woman named Adesuwa. But they knew the name, and they knew what it meant. On the first day of 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation took legal effect. In the plantation house where Adesuwa, Charlotte in the ledger, stood with her hands still and her face carefully neutral as the news circulated through the white household in voices that mixed anger and fear. She repeated the name silently in her mind the way she had repeated it every morning since childhood. Adesuwa, Adesuwa, Adesuwa. The Emancipation Proclamation was a war measure, limited in its immediate geographical application to states in rebellion, incapable of enforcement in areas not yet under Union control. It did not free anyone in the plantation South overnight. The hundreds of thousands of enslaved people on Georgia's plantations did not wake up on January 2nd unchained. The overseers were still there. The work was still demanded. The terror that enforced compliance was still operational. But something had changed, not in the external conditions, not yet, but in the quality of interior experience. The thing that had been prayed for in the Hush Harbor clearings for decades had been named in law. It had been written in a document that could not be unwritten. It had the force of presidential order, and eventually, it would have the force of amendment to the Constitution. The crown was returning. Adesuwa went to her mother that night. Folake was old. Her body had given everything the plantation had demanded, and then some. But her mind was clear and her memory was intact, and when her daughter came to sit beside her in the cabin and took her hand, she understood what the moment was without being told. They said it. Folake nodded. Not free yet. But said. Not yet, Folake agreed. They sat in silence for a while. Then Adesuwa said, "Tell me the whole story. All of it. From the beginning. From the ship." Folake looked at her daughter. She began. She told of a woman who had arrived in Georgia with a name that no one in this country knew. She told of a ledger and a man with a pen. She told of 20 years of rice fields and the practice of whispering a name into the darkness. She told of a daughter born in the slave quarter and given a name that the ledger would not hold. She told of a morning and a wagon and a hand gripping a hand hard enough to leave the memory of warmth. She said, "You are Folake. Do not forget." Adesuwa listened to the whole of it without interrupting. She had heard pieces before, but the whole of it in sequence in her mother's voice, on this particular night, this was different. This felt like a ceremony. When Folake finished, Adesuwa was quiet for a long time. "She never found out what happened to you." "No," Folake said. "She never knew if the name survived." "No." Adesuwa thought about this. "Then I will say it, as loud as I can. So if she can hear anything, wherever she is, she will know." Folake looked at her daughter. She smiled in the particular way of someone who understands that they have accomplished the central work of their life. Adesuwa raised her voice slightly, not shouting, not yet, the external world was still not safe for that, but loud enough that the sound carried real weight. "The crown has returned. Adesuwa, the crown has returned." The war ended in April 1865. The 13th Amendment was ratified in December of the same year. The institution that had named itself permanent, that had written itself into law as natural and necessary, that had invested billions of dollars in its own perpetuation, was over. The people who had been property were legally free. This is not the same as being free. What followed was a period of extraordinary and complicated becoming. The 4 million people who had been enslaved were now, legally, citizens in some definition of that word, a definition that was immediately contested, constrained, and attacked by the former slaveholding class and its political allies. The promises of Reconstruction were partly kept and then largely broken. The land that had been promised was not redistributed. The civil rights that were guaranteed by amendment were systematically denied by law, custom, and violence. But something remained that could not be unmade. The people who walked out of the plantations in the spring and summer of 1865, who traveled to cities, who sought family members from whom they had been separated by sale across decades, who registered their names in the Freedmen's Bureau records that constitute one of the most heartbreaking and extraordinary archives in American history. These people were not empty. They had done what Adesuwa had done, and what Folake had done, and what Efua had done in keeping a promise. They had kept themselves. Adesuwa, Charlotte in the old ledger, Adesuwa in the name her mother had given her on the first night of her life, walked out of the plantation in the summer of 1865. She was 35 years old. She was free in the legal sense, and she understood precisely what that did and did not mean. She went to the Freedmen's Bureau office in the nearest town to register her name. The bureau agent, a young man from Ohio who had come south with genuine but limited understanding of the complexity of what he was being asked to administer, asked her name. She told him, "Not Charlotte. Not Eliza. Adesuwa." The agent looked up from his form. "Can you spell that?" She could not. She had never been taught to read or write. Literacy had been illegal for enslaved people across the South, and the prohibition had been enforced. She had learned to hold a language in memory, not in letters. She said it again slowly. "Adesuwa." The agent wrote it down. He spelled it phonetically, which meant he spelled it imperfectly, which meant the record would not be a perfect record. But it would exist. For the first time in the history of this name, it would exist in a document that was not a plantation ledger, not a sale record, not an item in a list of property. It would exist in a document that acknowledged the person named as a person. She walked out of the bureau office into the summer heat and stood for a moment in the light. Her grandmother had said it in a rice field in Georgia, alone, to no one, as a form of resistance against the absence of anyone to hear it. Her mother had said it in a cotton field cabin, in whispers, to a child who was then taken away. She had said it every morning of her life in the privacy of her own mind, maintaining it like a flame in the wind. And now it was written down. Imperfectly, but down. The crown had returned. It had taken 62 years and 3 generations. But it had returned. The Freedmen's Bureau records contain hundreds of thousands of names. Within those names, scholars have identified numerous African names and African name elements, evidence that the practice Adesuwa had engaged in was not singular. It was widespread. It was, in the language of historical analysis, a pattern. A documented, recurring, culturally significant pattern of identity preservation under conditions designed to make identity preservation impossible. The records also contain the other kind of evidence, the evidence of what was destroyed. The names that do not appear. The family connections that could not be re-established because the persons involved were dead, or had moved beyond reach, or had lost the specific names and locations that would have enabled the Bureau agents to connect them to their missing relatives. The evidence of the catastrophic scale of the family separation that the domestic slave trade had accomplished over 50 years. What the official record cannot hold is the texture of the interior life. It cannot hold the sound of a name whispered in a cabin in Georgia in 1805. It cannot hold the weight of a promise made by a woman named Adesuwa to a woman named Adesuwa at the moment of her death. It cannot hold the quality of attention with which a 5-year-old child listened to her mother's instruction in the last moments before separation. What the historical record holds, ultimately, is the evidence of survival. Not full survival, the losses were enormous and are still being reckoned. But partial survival. Cultural survival that was not accidental but intentional. That was the product of specific choices made by specific people under specific conditions of oppression. That was, in the most precise sense of the word, resistance. Adesuwa resisted. Folake resisted. The woman named Adesuwa in the Freedmen's Bureau record resisted. They resisted not with weapons or with public rebellion, though those forms of resistance also existed and are also documented and also honored. They resisted with syllables, with the refusal to let the interior world be emptied by the exterior world's demands, with the transmission of name and meaning and story across the narrowest possible channels, under the most hostile possible conditions, across 6 decades and 3 generations. The story this script tells is not exceptional. It is representative. Across the plantation South, across the decades of the antebellum period, across the 4 million people who were legally freed in 1865 and the generations that preceded and followed them, this practice occurred. The specific forms varied. The specific names were different. The specific moments of transmission had different qualities and different outcomes. Some names were lost. Some threads were cut by violence or by sale or by the sheer weight of the system's power. But enough survived to constitute a pattern. And the pattern says, they were not made into property. They were treated as property. They were legally designated as property. They were bought and sold as property. But they were not property. They were people. And they knew it. And they made sure their children knew it. And that knowledge, kept in names, in languages, in stories, in the practice of saying who you truly are in the dark where no one who would punish you can hear, was the seed from which everything came after. Why this story must be told without the word fiction. Every practice described in this script is documented. The renaming of enslaved Africans, documented. The retention of African names in private practice, documented. This is the fundamental injustice that this story attempts to address, in part, by the act of narrating. The absence of a person from the official record is not evidence that the person was not fully present and fully human. It is evidence of the intentions of those who kept the records. What we know from the records that did survive, the WPA narratives, the Freedmen's Bureau documentation, the archaeological record of enslaved communities, the linguistic analysis of African retentions in African American speech, the genealogical research of scholars and descendants, is that the people who were enslaved in America created and maintained interior and communal lives of extraordinary richness and complexity. They remembered. They transmitted. They resisted. This is not a story about exceptions. This is a story about what people do when the thing most central to their humanity is attacked. They protect it. They pass it on. They make sure it survives to be reclaimed when the conditions change. The conditions changed. The names are still being recovered. There are more names waiting to be remembered. Adesuwa, the crown has returned. Say it aloud. It deserves to be heard.